I want to begin by saying, acknowledging you people here today, in a sense, setting protocol. President of University of Belize, Dr. Vincent Palacio, uh, our guest of honor today, Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas, and Barbara Bulmer-Thomas in the audience. Members of the Board of Trustees of UP present here. Members of the Advisory Board of BelPri who are present. I see Her Excellency Annie Burns, the Ambassador of Police to Cuba, in the audience. Welcome, Annie. I see His Excellency Asad Shroman, Agent the ICJ present. I see the Ambassador of Japan in the audience, and if there are any other ambassadors present, thematic representatives. So Mr. Henry Anderson, the chairman of BelPri and the director of BSC. Emery Ford, one of our panelists, chief economist of the Central Bank of Belize. Leo Carlos Paul of the Ministry of Economic Transformation. Dr. Philip Castillo, assistant professor here at UB. Government officials present. I see that we have some representatives of international organizations and some deans and directors and faculty of the University of Belize present, and also staff. And especially to those students who are here. And all those viewing on Facebook, on the UB's Facebook page. It is delightful to have all of you here to think, to build knowledge and discuss new ideas about the economy of Belize. We used to hear all the time that economic growth is an essential pillar of sustainable development, sustainable human development. But we all know that if that growth is not equitable, and if it is not distributed in a way that is equitable, that we can have problems. And in a sense, that core idea is what I think we are going to be focusing on today. As you can see from the program, after some words of welcome, we will hear from Professor Bulmer-Thomas, followed by some brief responses by our expert panel, and then a question and answer period. I have to use this opportunity to inform that one of our panelists, Ms. Diana Castillo, the Director General of this Statistical Institute of Belize, will not be able to join us due to unavoidable circumstances at that institution. But we have 3 panelists today. The event agenda, you will see a QR code come up very shortly that will be one that you can use to get not only the agenda, but all the documents of today's event, including a link to the actual official report, but also links to 2 other documents, one being something called In Brief, which is a executive summary of the document that is separate. And secondly, it will be also something called Broke It Down, key takeaways from the report. Basically a dozen or so quick bullet points about what is in the report. And we intend to do this for everything we do, to make information more accessible, and we also will be sharing this information in other ways, as I will explain. Before we hear from our presenter today, I will invite Mr. Henry Anderson to help set the stage for today. Earlier this year, Mr. Anderson was elected as the first chairperson of the advisory board of BelPri. He is currently the very active CEO of the Development Finance Corporation of Belize and DFC. And he's no stranger to UB, having not only lectured here once, but also been a provost. So, Henry.
Morning, morning, Dylan. Thank you. Not often like the mic. It's my turn. So good morning and welcome. Protocol been established, but apart from welcome all present and those viewing, I have to acknowledge the presence of our president, Dr. Vincent Palacio, without whose energy and vision BelPri at UB would not be a reality today. And I have to also acknowledge our esteemed presenter, Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas. Thank you, Professor, for selecting BelPri to launch your insightful and provocative research paper on the economy of belief. I would also like to acknowledge a couple of people who I have worked with in my life. Dr. Kyle, who I think we are Professor Emeritus of UB. He's saying that, so Dr. Kyle, welcome. The chairman of the CGA, Mr. Irving, he spent 10 years in the trench. Nice seeing you. CEO of SSB. Me to borrow money from him, so I have to recognize him. Jerome, welcome. So let me use a few minutes I have just to share a bit about BelPri and to highlight some of our current work plans. BelPri is a very young institute, officially launched just in March of this year as an independent public policy institute at UB. Our mission is to produce high quality and accessible research and knowledge that contribute to the improving public policy making in Belize and its impact on our sustainable and resilient development. As such, pub, as such, policy research, policy development, and policy influence on key issues of national development comprise the core of our work. We do this work using three broad approaches. The first approach comprises of our own BelPri initiated policy research projects that we execute independently based on priorities that we define internally. In this category, we now have two active projects on the way and two in the pipeline. The two that are on the way are one, a policy research project on the topic of regulating money in politics and peace, and two, a research project aimed at developing a Belize public policy tracker and monitor that will be publicly available to all. Both of these will be launched this year. The pipeline projects being developed at BelPri are one, an ambitious project on land tenure use in Belize today, basically trying to answer the question who owns what land, and two, a project to independently assess the process and content of the annual national budgets in Belize. These will be rolled out in 2026. The second approach of projects are those where government ministries and entities agree for us at BelPri to lead or collaborate in a development of a specific policy of national interest or the revision of a national public policy. You will be hearing of initiatives in this category very soon. Third approach is identifying important research that is being done by other researchers and policy analysis on topical issues, and then for BelPri to publish such research. What we're doing here today, in collaboration with Professor Bulmer-Thomas and his research on the economy of Belize, is a perfect example of this approach. For all these three approaches, there are basic common requirements: rigorous and objective research and analysis, accessible results, and the goal of policy influence. BelPri has a lot more in the works. For example, policy discussion sessions, training in policy making, public policy degrees, and more. We invite you to visit the BelPri page on the UB website to find out more. For ease of reference, as Dylan mentioned, you can find our QR code that is on the program for today's session. 2 weeks ago, I attended the 25th William G. Demas Memorial Lecture titled The Caribbean Challenge, Fostering Growth and Resilience Amidst Global Uncertainty. That was delivered by Dr. Nigel Clark, Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. He did a comparative analysis for the time periods 1980 to 2000 versus 2001 to 2023 to look at what factors impacted growth in the Caribbean. So I am curious, I won't say what he said, but I'm curious to hear Professor Bulwer-Thomas's presentation. And in chatting with him, I think he's one. But let us get to the matter at hand. What a wide variety of Belizeans and institutions I see here today. I see academics, I see representatives of civil society, of the business sector, students, members of the Diplomatic Corps faculty, and public servants. Again, welcome to all and do enjoy the BelPri event here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. Now to the main event. It's a very special honor for me, uh, personal honor for me to be introducing uh, Victor Bulmer-Thomas today. In 2013, when I was what was called a mature student doing my PhD, uh, he was the examiner for my viva for my PhD examination. Um, that thesis, as you may know, eventually turned into a book. So the examination obviously went well enough. But I can tell you that having him as an examiner was like yikes, with a brilliant mind who knows so much about Belize. Since that time, Victor and I and his wife Barbara have become very good friends, and so it's a very personal pleasure for me to share with you who Victor is. You may have heard, if you listen to Uncut, that there was an introduction in video given of Victor, but just a few words of introduction for those of you who might not know. Victor is honorary professor in the Institute of the Americas at the University College London. He studied at Oxford University, where he completed his doctoral studies on Costa Rica with a thesis entitled An Input-Output Planning Model for Costa Rica. Later, while working at a Scottish Policy Institute, he contributed to the construction of an input-output model of Scotland. Yes, it sounds like Victor is a big fan of the input-output model, as we'll hear today. Subsequently, Victor worked at the London University as a development economist before becoming the director of University's Institute of Latin American Studies. He then became the director of Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, in fact, one of the very foremost policy institutes in the United Kingdom, if not the world. Subsequently, he worked, God, I sound like Donald Trump just now. Subsequently, he worked at the Latin American Caribbean Center at Florida International University in Miami. The author, editor of 30 books, he is best known for his research on the economic history of Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the rise and fall of the English and the U.S. empires. Importantly, he co-authored with Barbara Bulmer-Thomas the Economic History of Belize, published by Kubola in 2012, and I use this opportunity to share that book is available today outside. Kubola is in the house, and it's available for $35. It's still a book that is a much must read for those of us involved in this kind of work. Victor has received honors from the governments of Brazil, Colombia, and the UK, and was editor of the Journal of Latin American Studies for 12 years. Some of you may know that Victor first came to Belize in 1966 as a VSO volunteer when he taught at St. Michael's College. Barbara, who is from Belize, and Victor spend time in Belize annually and follow developments here keenly. And some big news, Victor has recently applied for Belizean nationality. I don't know if this has anything to do with developments in his home country, the UK, but I'm sure that this will be just a formality. Victor, you have long been an honorary citizen of Belize in my eyes and the eyes of many Belizeans. Colleagues, I'm honored to introduce Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas. Yes. The mic.
Thank you, Dylan. That was very kind of you. I think because he's limited me to 30 minutes, I better get stuck in right away. And let me start by saying that I gave a lot of thought to this paper because in some ways it's quite upsetting. And I'm not the sort of person who likes to upset people unless I feel it's really important. And the reason why it's upsetting is because using the data that are generated here in Belize, these are not my data, it's clear to me that there has been a stagnation of living standards in Belize over the last 2 decades. And specifically that the gross domestic product at constant prices per head is the same today as it was in 2007, nearly 20 years ago. And that is a somewhat frightening statistic because it's in complete contrast to the previous 25 years, the first 25 years after independence, when growth was quite respectable. Now, of course, if everybody else has had stagnant living standards, then Belize's relative position would be the same. And that's what the chairman was hinting at, that possibility. And that is true. There are countries in the Caribbean which have stagnated like Belize. But unfortunately, well, not unfortunately for them, very good for them, but Belize has effectively been falling in relative terms. And as we'll see in a minute, its position, both within the Caribbean and within Central America, has deteriorated quite seriously. So clearly, then, we will have to ask ourselves, well, why? So the first question is when? When did all this happen? Second question is why? And the third question is what to do about it. Now, there is another W, and that is, of course, who. But I'm not going to get into that, not just because of the political dimension to this. The fact is that we're talking about deep structural problems in the Belizean economy, which affects both blue and red administrations. So there's no need to call out individuals. This is something that goes, frankly, much deeper than that. So let me start, if I may, with this first. What did I wrong?
My bad. Okay, whoops. No.
Okay. So here we have, using data provided by the Belize statistical authorities, either the Statistical Institute of Belize or the central bank. Sorry. Yeah. So looking at the gross domestic product per head between 1980 and 2024, and you'll see this very significant rise from the time of independence up to the peak in 2007. And then this somewhat tragic situation subsequently of a slow decline, but of course, what seems like a very dramatic recovery in the period after COVID. So you see the big in 2020 with COVID, and then you see a big recovery in 21, 22, as you will find all over the world as a result of is that me doing that one? Or no? Okay. But notice in 2023, there is actually a fall before you get, again, a significant leap in 2024, which just so happened to have been an election year. So if you look at those last 4 years where the line is going up, it's very tempting, and I know plenty of people who will want to say this, is that, well, the problem is solved because we've now put Belize on a new growth path, a new sustainable growth path, and we can forget about all those terrible years when GDP per head was falling and so on. I think that would be very misleading because what you're looking at here is a recovery. And if we look at the prognosis for this year and the next few years, you will see that on any kind of objective measure, the outlook for Belize in terms of GDP per head is not that brilliant. I'll come back to that later on, of course. So now, let's see how Belize fares in relation to the other two regions to which it belongs, the Caribbean and Central America. Now, this is a table that is quite difficult to produce, actually, because in the Caribbean, there are 34 countries. If you take, by that, all the islands, plus the 3 Guyanas and Belize, 16 are independent, like Belize, and 18 are non-independent. The non-independent countries, some are very small, like St. Eustatius, for example, but some are pretty big, like Puerto Rico. But those 18 are non-independent. So you put them together, you have 34 countries. Now, because there are 2 outliers, there is Haiti at the bottom and there is the Cayman Islands at the top. I've dropped those off this graph because otherwise it distorts the image that you will be looking at. So please understand that on the right-hand side, after Jamaica, there is Haiti, and on the left-hand side, next to the Virgin Islands, is the Cayman Islands. And you will see that there is Belize, second from bottom, i.e. third from bottom when we include Haiti. So only Jamaica and Haiti have a lower GDP per head in 2022 using a 3-year average and constant prices. Now, when did this happen? Well, if we look at the next graph, because I was shocked and surprised when I saw that, to be honest. I assumed that Belize would be somewhere in the bottom 10, but I didn't expect to find it third from the bottom. So if we look at this, I run the same table, the same graph for different periods. The 5-year period, taking an average of 1999 to 2003, then 2009 to 2013, then 2019 to 2023. So in that 20 years ago, Belize was ranked 7th from the bottom. And the countries that had a lower income per head than Belize were St. Vincent, Dominican Republic, Guyana, Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti. Then 15 years ago, or 10, no, let's say 15 years ago, Belize's rank from the bottom was 5th. The countries below were Dominican Republic, Guyana, Jamaica, Haiti. And now we see below Belize just Jamaica and Haiti. So you can see a number of countries, St. Vincent, Dominican Republic, Guyana, Cuba, which have jumped above Belize. So it's not that everybody has had this stagnation of living standards that Belize has had. Some have been able to move above Belize. Now look at Central America. Now in Central America, Belize is ranked, there are 7 countries if you include Panama. Belize is ranked third. Richer are Panama and Costa Rica, and poorer are Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. And the Belize is still ranked third, so its ranking hasn't changed. The problem is that the ratio of the Belize GDP per head to everyone else has deteriorated. So in the first row, you'll see the ratio of Belize to the whole of Central America. And 25 years ago, it was 134.5, meaning Belize, the Belizean economy GDP per head was 34.5% higher than the average. And then look at it at 87.7. That means that Belize is now lower than the average for all of Central America. In the case of Panama, which is richer than Belize, Belize was 82% of the Panamanian figure. Now it's 40%. In the case of Costa Rica, it was 74%. Now it's 45%. In the case of Guatemala, Belize is still richer than Guatemala in terms of GDP per head, but the gap is shrinking. Belize was 79% higher, now it's 33% higher. In the case of El Salvador, it was 93% higher, now it's 40% higher, and so on. So in the case of every single country in Central America, the Belize position has deteriorated in terms of GDP per head at constant prices. Now, the question is why? And to answer that question, given that I'm looking at GDP and GDP per head, it obviously makes sense to try and break down the gross domestic product and see exactly where this problem arose. I have some sympathy with those who say GDP is nonsense, it's a waste of time, it doesn't measure what we want to measure, etc., etc. But of course, we are stuck with it, and governments and politicians and businesses, they look to it every year, they expect to find information within it. And so I think it makes sense, at least for the purposes of this talk, to do the same. There are three ways of measuring the gross domestic product. I don't want to get too technical here, but essentially there are three ways. One looks at the components of final demand. So that's household consumption, government consumption, investment, and exports, less, and then you subtract imports. That's one way of doing it. The other is to look at the value added in each sector of the economy, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, and so on. Add them all up, you get GDP. The third is to look at factor incomes, wages and profits, and then add in net indirect taxes. Now, Belize only doesn't do the third method, it just uses the first two, the final expenditure method and the value added method. And the two should be the same, and they are fairly close in the way that Belize calculates them. And then to reconcile the two, there's a small reconciliation made by the statistical authorities. And the story that you tell with regard to why, you should be able to tell not the same, but a similar story, whether you're looking at final expenditure or value added. They should be consistent with each other. But I'm going to focus on the final expenditure story, and I'm going to start with exports. So we can ask, what about exports per head in Belize? Well, we can compare exports per head with exports per head in other countries in the region, both in Central America and in the Caribbean. And we can ask ourselves, well, what should Belize exports per head be, taking into account the two main variables which explain exports per head? One is population and one is GDP. So if we just do a simple multiple regression analysis, econometrics, what results would we get for Belize? And the answer is this. We find that on the left-hand column, we have actual exports. So in Belize, they were $2,981 US per head. And then we have the predicted exports, the exports that we would get if this model was used to predict what Belize's exports should be. And you can see that they are 3,752. In other words, Belize is roughly 26% below what it should be, in inverted commas. Now, there might be all sorts of reasons why a country is below or a country is above its predicted value. And you can see there's a huge range. So Honduras is way above what you would predict from the model. Dominica is way below. But it's a signal. It's not proof. It's not proof. This is correlation, and it's not causation. It's a signal that there may be something wrong with the size of exports per head in Belize, and this is a factor that's been holding back its performance. The second is to look at investment. Now, just to give you a clue as to the importance of investment, have a look at this graph. Again, these are all numbers that are provided by the Belize statistical authorities to the public, as well as to international agencies like the World Bank. And this is the GDP per employed person, not per head, which is the whole population. This is the GDP per employed person. And you can see this downward trend, and then, thank goodness, a little boost after the first year of COVID. But the downward trend is pretty clear. Now, that suggests that something's gone wrong with the investment process, because you should really be getting more GDP per employed person if the investment process is working well. If workers have a bigger capital stock to work with, well, you'd expect output per employed person to be working well. And it clearly isn't. So then we have to look in more detail at the breakdown of investment in Belize. Now, this is not easy because the published figures on investment, I know different government departments have much more information, but what's available to independent researchers such as myself is quite limited. So what I've done is I've started here with a look at the information which is for 2014, which is, for reasons that I'll explain later, a very, very detailed breakdown of the investment pattern in Belize. And you can see that in the case of where's the best place to start? Probably with the number of 100 over in the right-hand column. And then you can break it down with 42% of that coming from the public sector, then nearly 11% from residential investments, 47.1 from corporate, and those last two become to 58. And then you can break it down by the individual categories, and the final line shows you how much of investment actually was based on imports. And you can see the very high figure for corporates, because, of course, corporates in their investment patterns rely very heavily on importing capital goods and so on. Why does this matter? Well, if we look at the next graph, you can see how the share of investment in GDP over the last 20 years, what has happened. So in the first column, you'll have what's called gross fixed capital formation. That's what most people think of as investment. The average has been 17%. That's low. That's low. A country like Belize should definitely be somewhere between 20 and 30. There were 1 or 2 years when it did get above 20, like the maximum of 22.2, but the minimum was 13, and the standard deviation means there's been a lot of jumping around in the numbers. The next column is foreign direct investment. The average has been 5.5, which is reasonably high, but there's been tremendous volatility. So the maximum was 10, the minimum was less than 1%. And then you come to domestic. Now, I think domestic is the key. This is domestic private investment. A healthy economy with sustainable growth needs high levels of domestic private investment. And it doesn't have them in Belize because the average has been 11.5%, and that's simply not high enough. Then we come to the public, which is 5.8. I don't have any problem with that at all. I know some people do. I'm not one who thinks that the public sector should not be investing. In Belize, they certainly should be. So the figure there that jumps out to me is the low ratio of GDP that is accounted for by domestic private investment, 11.5% on average over that long period. And if you're looking for reasons why there's been stagnation in the Belize economy, we've now got two. We've got the exports per head too low, and we've got investment too low, and in particular, domestic private investment. Now, of course, when I spoke earlier, I talked about exports, but when you look at final expenditure, you have to subtract imports. So the question is, well, what's been happening to imports? Now, the good news is that imports per head, using that same simple econometric analysis I used earlier, the good news is that imports per head are lower than what would be predicted. Now, that means that in many ways, Belize has done well in terms of taking advantage of import substitution possibilities. We can see that in agriculture. Belize has gone from importing so many foodstuffs to producing them domestically, and in some cases even exporting them. But there is a puzzle which should make us a little bit concerned, and that is that over this period of stagnation of the last 20 years, imports per head have actually risen, and the share of imports in GDP has also risen. Now, that shouldn't have happened, because if you're a stagnant economy, then you would have expected imports per head to be the same, all of this in constant prices, by the way, and the share of imports in GDP to be about the same. And there are various possible reasons why this might come about, but to me, the most likely is a shift in income distribution and wealth inequality towards the richest people in the country. And the reason why this matters is that everybody knows that richer households import more. So if you're going to shift income from the lowest part of the income distribution to the highest part, you will get higher imports per head and a higher share of imports in GDP, even if your economy is stagnant. We don't have definitive proof. In the paper, I go into some detail about how we can use the scattered information available to us to get a kind of handle on what income inequality and wealth inequality in Belize are. But there is no definite proof. And so this is, I think, quite a high priority for the Belizean statistical authorities going forward, that they look at this issue. But my hunch is that there has been in the last 20 years a big increase in income and wealth inequality. We then come to government spending, which is part of this final expenditure category. Now, everybody knows that you cannot spend more as a share of GDP unless you have an increase in revenue. To do so in Belize would either lead to a balance of payments crisis or an inflation crisis. So the question is it possible for Belize to extract more revenue without doing serious damage to the economy? And the answer is yes, and it's not a case of raising tax rates. The issue in Belize is not that the tax rates aren't high enough. They're very high. The problem is that there's so many exceptions and exemptions and avoidance and evasion and, in some cases, dare I say it, corruption, that the revenue that is obtained is actually significantly lower than it could and should be. Were it higher, then government spending would be higher, and you would get and then an uplift in terms of GDP per head if it was handled correctly. Right. Now, the question then, and I know I'm running out of time, so this is important, is what to do about it. Now, normally, someone like me would come along and say, well, you know, we need to increase regional integration opportunities, or we need to provide this fiscal incentive, or we need to generate more jobs through some kind of subsidy scheme, or whatever it is. And I've done that in the past, and to be honest, there's not much point, because these are very detailed issues that only public policy experts and government officials and political parties can really address. So I'm going to use the remainder of my time to try and tackle this in a completely different way. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because the Statistical Institute of Belize has already done the hard work towards what I'm going to propose. I would say they're like 80% of the way there, but they haven't gone the extra 20%. And yes, I am talking about input-output analysis, which is something which is very dear to my heart and which is much more widely used in the world than people might understand. In the paper, I mention all the different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that actually use it. They all use it for different purposes, not for the same purposes. But the point is to suggest a way in which Belize could extract or move to a different. Okay, thanks. So let me come back to what the Statistical Institute of Belize has done. To produce an input-output table from which you derive an input-output model, you need two tables. One is called a supply table and one is called a use table. Now, the SIB has done this, and it refers to the year 2014. It wasn't published until 3 years ago, and so it's already a bit out of date. But the point is they've done it, and they know how to do it again in the future. And it's very detailed. In fact, you could easily produce an input-output table of 100 rows and 100 columns, breaking down all the activities in the economy so that you don't just have something called GDP. In my view, the ideal size would be something around 30 to 40 sectors for Belize, which would give you tremendous richness in terms of understanding the interaction between the different parts of the economy as a result of various changes or shocks coming from outside. But what I've done, just to illustrate what I'm talking about, is to produce a tiny little input-output table, 6 sectors. And this is for the 6 sectors that I've identified. This, by the way, is the first ever input-output table for Belize. You're looking at it, right? It's got a first sector, number 1, is the primary sectors, including processed foods. The second is manufacturing, excluding processed foods. The third is construction. The fourth is tourism. The fifth is other service exports, things like BPOs, call centers and stuff like that. And the final one is domestic services. Now, the rows, the columns is the easiest thing to understand. These are coefficients. They tell you that for every 100 Belize dollars of output in sector 1, that's the primary one, then 0.25, that's a quarter of that 100, will go to purchase goods from that very same sector. And in the case of the second sector, it would be for every $100, they would be buying $2 from the second sector. In the case of the sixth sector, they'd be buying $10 for the sake. So for each sector, you can look about how they interact with the other sectors in the economy. From this, you then get something called the inverse matrix, which is quite complicated to explain. But what it shows you is that, let's imagine that the final demand for sector 1 increases by $1. Then if you look at the first column there, primary commodities, including processed products, you'll see that the impact on the gross output of all the other sectors is in total 1.55. So $1 of final demand for the primary sector then has this impact on the first, second, none on the 3, 4, and 5, but also on the sixth sector. And you can do that for each sector of the economy. And you can see the impact is very different. So manufacturing, an increase in final demand for manufacturing will have a bigger impact, 1.65, on all the sectors of the economy than for any of the others. And the weakest impact is for domestic services. So when final demand for domestic services increase, that has a smaller impact on the gross output. Now let's imagine that we have an increase of $1 million, not $1, $1 million in the increase in final demand. And we want to know not just the impact on the total gross output of the whole economy, but also on imports, unskilled wages, skilled wages, gross profits, and then on the number of workers that might be employed. So this is consistent with the table that you saw before. So imagine, for some reason, we want to simulate the impact of an additional $1 million demand, final demand for the first sector. That's the primary sector, including processed foods. And you can see that that would lead to an increase in gross output from all the sectors, not just from the first sector, of 1,554,664. It would then generate additional imports into the whole economy, 272,000. It would generate unskilled wages of that 163,000, skilled wages of 108,000, gross profits of 450,000, and an additional 12 unskilled workers and 6 skilled workers. We can do that for each sector of the economy, and you would begin to get a sense of how different the impact of an increase in final demand is on the whole Belize economy, depending on which sector you're talking about. And then finally, we'd get to this, which is, let's suppose we were trying to imagine an increase in exports that would bring Belizean exports up to the level predicted by that model earlier on. That would be an additional $600 million worth of exports, yeah? So let's just suppose first that it all came from the primary sector. So we're selling more commodities and stuff like that into the rest of the world. Well, you can see the impact on gross output will be an additional 933 million across the whole economy, all 6 different sectors. Then you see the impact on imports, then the impact on unskilled wages, and so on. Then we do the same for tourism. That's the other possible export source of demand for exports. And you can see we're getting different numbers in that second row. And finally, we do it for the non-tourism service exports, like BPOs, yeah? And there you can see, again, we're getting a different set of numbers. And the final row is if we imagine, instead of 600 million being the additional demand for one sector, we have 200 million for each of the 3. So the final will be mixed, meaning 200 for primary, 200 for tourism, 200 for non-tourism. And you'll see some numbers in bold. So, for example, if your main concern was generating a large unskilled wage bill, well, you'd focus on increasing final demand for the primary sector. But if your main concern was generating an increase in skilled wages, well, your focus would probably be more on tourism. And if you were focusing more on gross profits, then your interest would be more in the non-tourism service exports. So what this very, very simple input-output model is showing you, that is not enough just to say, let's increase exports by 600 million. We need to know how that would break down and what impact it would have, not just on output and imports, but also on income distribution, because clearly, if it's more beneficial to gross profits than it is to unskilled wages, well, you're going to get a deterioration in income distribution. So it's time for me to finish. I think that this, given, I wouldn't have, as I said earlier, I would not have mentioned the phrase input-output analysis if the Statistical Institute of Belize hadn't already taken us 80% of the way there. That supply and use table are sitting on their website, but nobody uses them because they haven't been turned into an input-output table. And because there's no input-output table, you can't build an input-output model. It just seems to me very sad that all that work and effort and money was put into the supply and use table, and then the relatively simple bit has yet to be done. And I think were it to be done on a regular basis, then I think policymakers in Belize would be able to think about the economy differently, imagining new paradigms and all the rest of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. Insightful and provocative indeed. And at BelPri, we have no problems in being provocative as long as it is based on informed analysis, research, and open discussions. As I said before, we do have the full copy of Victor's presentation. You can get a copy of it from the QR codes that are at the back and on the side, and we'll be putting it up again. But let's go straight into getting some reaction, stimulating some discussion on Victor's paper from 3 experts, people who work in some aspect of the economy and developing the economy. And we will have each of them share immediate responses for 5 minutes, and then they will also be able to participate later on in the discussion. Before I introduce them, let me state that they are contributing here today to a conversation and not necessarily sharing policy positions of the organization that they come from. I will introduce all 3, and then we will they will present one after the other, and you can stay seated or you can use the mic if you want. First of all, Mr. Emery Ford. Emery Ford has been the chief economist at the Central Bank of Belize since June 2024 and oversees the research and exchange control departments. He began his career at the bank in November 2000 as an economist in the research department and has held several leadership posts at the bank since. He is recognized as a distinguished voice within the macroeconomic policy landscape of Belize. Welcome, Emery. Mr. Carlos Paul has been the Chief Executive Officer of the Ministry of Economic Transformation since March 2025. During his 23 years working with the government of Belize, he has served in different capacities in the ministry. He has and continues to represent the Ministry of Economic Transformation on various councils, committees, task forces, and boards. It is noteworthy that the CEO, Paul, did his first degree here at UB and is then a product of UB. Finally, Dr. Philip Castillo. Dr. Castillo is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Management and Social Sciences of University of Belize, and he lectures in various economics and public finance courses. He has served on the board of directors of the Statistical Institute of Belize and on the People's Constitution Commission, and he represents the university on the National Trade Negotiating Commission. He most recently contributed to the published regional study to evaluate health inequities in 5 Caribbean countries. His PhD is from the University of the West Indies. So without further ado, I will ask them to go in order, Mr. Ford, Mr. Paul, and then Dr. Castillo. Up to you.
Good morning, everyone. With all protocols already established, allow me to express my appreciation for the opportunity to contribute to today's important discussion. This academic paper is presented at a critical juncture of our history, as Belize faces several interconnected crises that are simultaneously escalating and creating a complex, challenging policy environment. As a respondent, I stand before you as an admirer of this study, aiming to briefly highlight its key tenets to reinforce a major goal of the study, which I believe is to illustrate and advocate for the use of an empirical framework for understanding key macroeconomic dynamics to inform and shape policy decisions in Belize. Utilizing real GDP per capita at constant 2015 prices as a proxy for well-being or standard of living, Bulmer-Thomas presented a visual representation of the evolution of this indicator over time. The results show that starting from a very low position, Belize's real GDP per capita doubled in the 25 years following the country's independence through 2003 to 2007, and then effectively stagnated during the subsequent 2 decades up to 2024. The latter period was marked by significant growth volatility, beset by a multitude of adverse exogenous and endogenous factors, promulgating a series of boom and bust economic cycles. Bulmer-Thomas expanded his analysis of Belize's real GDP per capita by comparing this matrix to other nations in the Caribbean and Latin America. Despite contributing to the literature on regional convergence hypothesis, from which Belize is frequently excluded, he discovered that Belize's rank in terms of real GDP per capita among 34 Caribbean nations has diminished over time, placing it near the lower end of the spectrum, only surpassing Jamaica and Haiti. Belize's relative standing position among the 7 Central American countries remains constant. However, its relative position has deteriorated as the country's average real per capita growth shifted from above the regional average to below during the review period. Despite the challenges, the data collection challenges, Bulmer-Thomas's examination of the ongoing decline in Belize's standard of living is corroborated by other studies. His findings correspond with a forthcoming IMF paper, which indicates that the potential GDP growth for Caribbean countries has been on a downward trend in the last 2 decades, with Belize nearly at the forefront of the group due to declining total factor productivity and human capital productivity. It also notes that the income levels in the Caribbean relative to those in the United States show no convergence since 1990, in contrast to emerging markets in Asia and Europe, which have seen clear convergence. To comprehend the reasons behind the stagnation in Belize's real GDP per capita over the past 2 decades, Bulmer-Thomas examined the constituents of real GDP by final expenditure. In summary, the author determined that per capita growth in Belize stagnated due to several factors. Exports per capita fell short of expectations by approximately 25.9%, while imports per capita are 40% below anticipated levels, suggesting the likelihood of increasing income inequality. The investment ratio is low, at less than 20% of GDP, averaging 17% from 2004 to 2023. Furthermore, labor productivity has been declining in the last 20 years. Government spending is inadequate, cognizant of Belize's high fixed costs for delivering public services, particularly due to suboptimal tax collection to meet spending needs, along with structural weaknesses in public investment management. Yet, private consumption is excessively high, underscoring symptoms of firm-level resource misallocation and increasing income and wealth inequality. Thus, the study indicates that the factors contributing to the stagnation in per capita GDP growth over the 20-year period are broad-based, highlighting deficiencies in capital investment, the growth of human capital, and technological progress when framed through the lens of the neoclassical growth model literature. To address these challenges, the author skillfully set the stage by outlining the structure of the Belizean economy. He depicted Belize as a small, open economy that relies on an export-led growth model to advance its economic development and industrialization, create employment in export-oriented industries, and generate foreign exchange to cover the costs of essential imported goods and services. Against this backdrop, Bulmer-Thomas constructed an input-output matrix using the data from the Statistical Institute of Belize's 2014 supply and use tables, using what he described as fairly heroic assumptions due to severe data limitations. In his policy recommendation for increasing the long-term growth of real GDP per capita, Bulmer-Thomas suggests that there is no single silver bullet solution. He points out that the necessary reforms are well known and include measures such as reducing corruption, ministerial discretion, fiscal incentives, and debt, while improving public services, particularly in education, and advancing bilateral or multilateral trade agreements to better access markets where Belize has a comparative advantage. He also warned against the go big or go home mindset, which tends to prioritize ambitious projects that may necessitate extensive government concessions. Instead, he recommends that the government utilize the input and output framework to prioritize essential changes for achieving the desired macroeconomic outcomes. Such changes should lead to increased exports of goods and services per capita, a higher investment ratio, particularly from the domestic private sector, a reduction in income and wealth inequality, enhanced public services, and an exploration of viable opportunities in import substitution, especially in expanding renewable energy production. Moreover, this information must be communicated to all economic actors, including development partners, to inform them about the types of projects the government will endorse. In conclusion, I congratulate Professor Bulmer-Thomas for authoring a timely, insightful, and analytical rigorous paper. This important work not only diagnoses the structural and cyclical changes confronting the Belizean economy amidst rising global uncertainty, geopolitical tension, climate risks, and internal structural challenges, but also proposes a pragmatic framework to guide policy reform. The utilization of empirical evidence, comparative regional analysis, and innovative application of an input-output model offers a valuable foundation for informed economic policymaking. As Belize navigates a complex global and domestic landscape, this paper acts as a clarion call for evidence-based strategies, institutional strengthening, and inclusive growth. I hope this endeavor will provoke further research, dialogue, and decisive action towards a more resilient and prosperous Belize. Thank you.
Listen, good morning. Allow me to first thank UB Policy Research Institute for extending an invitation to the Ministry of Economic Transformation. Given our mandate, our role within the government, it was very important for us to be present and to have some reactions on what has been called by CEO and then by Dr. Vernon as insightful and provocative research. Congratulations, Dr. Bulmer-Thomas, for that research and giving us a true picture of what the findings have indicated to him and what the data that, as he clearly indicated, has been provided by the government of Belize through the Central Bank and the Statistical Institute of Belize. Allow me to make a contribution, or my intervention will be on 5 strategic areas or 5 areas based on the presentation. First, I want to look or address poverty. You had indicated that the report raises concern about stagnation in per capita growth. Allow me to indicate that the government of Belize has prioritized poverty reduction, and we have seen measurable success. In fact, poverty reduction is one of the 6 strategic objectives within Belize's medium-term development strategy. The data is there, statistics there, shows that by 2021, using the World Bank measurement of poverty, food baskets and calories, we were about 52% of poverty rate. And then government, realizing the limitations that we have with the methodology, has embarked or has agreed to use the multidimensional poverty index. And we have seen, given the statistics again by SIB, that we have reduced poverty from 36.5 in 2022 to about 22.1 in 2024, using the multidimensional poverty, which has, I think, four key indicators and sub-indicators looking at the social aspects. The substantial decline in this poverty reduction is a direct result of the government's intervention in education, in health, in MSMEs, and infrastructure. How we do that? With implementing certain policies. In education, we roll out the free primary and secondary education program. We have the upliftment project with the Ministry of Education that provides free education and meals to very needy students to a number of high schools at the national level. We have expanded the national health insurance, which includes Cayo district now, which was the district that was pending for the first period of their manifesto. We are in the process of constructing new hospitals for Belmopan and San Pedro, and we are in the process of executing feasibility studies for new hospitals in Orange Drab, Belize City, and Punta Gorda. We have also been able, through my ministry, with the creation of the Climate Finance Unit, be able to access concessional financing, particularly for MSMEs. And CEO Anderson is here to testify that we have some obtained some finances that will be diverted through DFC. We have provided over 300 starter houses to much needed single parents. We have been able, are in the process of preparing a social protection policy and strategy. And the list can go on the policy intervention that the government has taken in order to address poverty. Second point, economic transformation and growth. Economic performance in Belize has been doing good based on the methodology and indicator we have been quantifying it along with the IMF. We have seen high real growth in Belize. Between 2021 and 2024, the economy has grown by an annual average of 9.5%, which is above what the IMF has projected and far above what the medium-term development strategy had as its target. We wanted to grow between 5 to 7.5 annually, and we have grown at a rate of 9.5. The government remained focused on building the foundations for long-term, diversified, and sustained growth. And this includes, how we plan to do this includes investment in human capital, innovation, and key sector areas such as education, agriculture, manufacturing, and energy. We know the role that government plays. We know it's critical that we are part of the process of development. So in doing so, the government is keen in creating employment. The government is keen in making target investments and ensuring that we have an environment that is conducive for the private sector to come under investment and to have foreign direct investment. Employment. Economic policies have contributed to the low record of employment that we have had. I think it's 2.1% as of September of 2024. Between 2021 and 2024, the labor force have expanded from 175,000 to 195,000 persons. Participation rose from 50.3 to 57.4 while the unemployment have dropped. This has been given the deliberate choices that the government has taken in addressing job creation. Although the statistics show something, we have to look very carefully on the disaggregated data because there's a high percentage of that data that is of the women that is not on the labor force. So in addressing this, the government has approached two multilateral development partners, IDB and World Bank. IDB will help us with a labor participation project, and the World Bank will help us with an early childhood development and female empowerment project. And the idea is for us to allow that opportunity for the female to be able to have some level of employment. The fourth point I want to touch is the investment, the public investment that was presented. Our public sector investment program is one of our key mandates at the Ministry of Economic Transformation. We monitor and we report on the level of investment that we have in country. At the end of last year, December 2024, we had an investment of 2.1 billion. This is an increase from 1.56 billion in 2020 to what we are to the 2.1 in 2024. And important to note that although we had an investment, this huge investment, it's more on the economic services sector that it's pays particular attention to industry, MSMEs, and energy. If we look at a breakdown of these figures, the statistics, we can see a reduction in loans from 2020 to 24, but an increase in grants. So what does that says? That government is focused is obtaining highly concessional or grant financing. And finally, because I don't have much time, the private sector. Government has been working very closely with the private sector for us to mobilize concessional financing through DFC and other partners. We have reduced some bureaucratic hurdles for MSMEs, and we have launched a pre-financing mechanism. Overall, the government acknowledged the concerns why Belize has fell behind and is actively working on measures to reverse this trend through diversification, capacity building, data reform, and climate investment. As the paper reminds us, recovery is not the same as transformation. Our goal remains sustainable, inclusive growth, and to improve the lives today, to build a resilience for tomorrow. At the same time, we are clear-eyed about the need to close the structural gaps and that have allowed Belize to fall behind our regional peers in regards to per capita growth. So let us continue the dialogue with openness, clarity, and a shared vision for Belize's development. Thank you.
Good morning, good morning. My presentation focuses on a topic that I do not think was adequately addressed in a presentation that focuses on Belize's economy in the 21st century. To make my point, I could focus on my two fellow panelists, Mr. Ford and Mr. Paul, and both their post-employment benefits, so what we call their pensions, would be different. There's a different scheme. And that is what my presentation is all about, to focus on pensions. When GOB hires a public officer, GOB has made a commitment to pay that person until death, because throughout your tenure in the public service, you're paid per month, basically, and at the end of that, you're paid a gratuity and a pension. That pension kicks in when you retire, and that goes on until you die. So then, this is the background. GOB's pension payments are non-contributory, and pensions are earned by various categories of public officers, teachers, and parliamentarians. Move on to the next slide. And this buttresses the point I've just made. Government's budget, last year's budget, the budget year was 2024-2025. GOB budgeted to pay $110 million in pension payments. GOB budgeted to pay $110 million. Now the financial year ends March 31st. So at that time, you're able to focus on what was actually spent. Notice, $132 million was actually spent. So government budgeted to spend $110 million. It spent over $20 million more. It spent $132 million. So you could see then, focusing on this financial year, the amount budgeted for pensions at $103.8 million, that's already under budget. Because we know now that government is negotiating with public officers for a raise of pay. That will be reflected in a raise of pension. The CEOs got their raise of pay. That might be reflected in increased pensions, etc. The constitutional issue remains unresolved. that might be reflected in an increase in pensions. And then government has committed to pay pensions for teachers who are in the church-state system. So you'll also see that being reflected. So what I can say then is that actual payments for the past financial year was $20 million above the budgeted amount. And that tells me that the estimates for 2025-2026, that is this current financial year, are substantially under budgeted. And then pension payments are set to rise since salaries are increasing, pensioners are living longer, and GOB has committed to pension payments, to full pension payments for all teachers. So in looking at the professor's paper, I was looking at what he called broke it down, or what Dr. Vernon would call broke it down. Focusing on high public service costs, it says, due to a small population and low population to land area ratio, Belize faces high fixed costs for public services, suggesting that state size is a constraint on meeting demand for quality public services. I will argue that state size will continue to be a constraint. What we are seeing is increasing expenditures on pensions, on pensions that are non-contributory. That means then that state size will continue to be a constraint as government's non-contributory pension scheme takes up an increasing portion of government's shrinking fiscal space. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panelists for stimulating our discussion today and bringing some different perspectives also to the paper presented by Victor. Now we'll get straight into some questions and comments from you. What we'll do is to take 3 questions or comments at a time. I ask that you be concise. You state your name at the beginning. We want to know who you are, and direct it at either our presenter today or one of the panelists, and we will have about 40 minutes for discussion. So, anyone wants to go first? Yes, there's a mic that is being brought to you.
Hi, good morning. Melanie Quigley. To Dr. Castillo, has any study been done on the differences in expenses between pensioners being retired at 55 and as opposed to working until 60, 65, what the ratio of expenditure or savings that would bring, meaning that someone working until 65 is still on a salary, while someone forcibly, I'm say forcibly because that's how I feel, retired at 55 when you can still contribute for an additional 5 or 10 years on a salary as opposed to being paid this lump sum of gratuity and this pension. Has any study been done relevance to that?
We'll take another question before we continue. Are there any others in the audience at this point in time? I don't see any. So while go ahead, please.
This brilliant analysis comes from Victor's paper in terms of, and Victor in his remarks and in the paper also speaks to this in terms of the use of GDP per capita as a proxy for well-being and standard of living. We know the work of Sen, who contributed to capabilities approach, that we need to look beyond this measure. Nevertheless, it is one of the best measures. But if we look at that, and we look at the data, and one of your comments also, Victor, was that if we look at the contributions to GDP, we take the tourism sector, look at it relative to the contributions of other tourism sectors in the region, look like there's more room for the growth in the sector. But my question is this: if we do that, it seems that this is where we're sort of placing all of our eggs in the tourism basket. If we look at these other aspects of how we look at well-being, is that necessarily the direction we want to go? So just in addition to looking at the input-output, which is critical, don't we also then have to address some of these other dimensions? Is it desirable that, for instance, if we get a better return from investment in tourism financially, is this the best in terms of capability development of human beings? Do we want to basically become a service or servitude economy, as some ask? So this is to anyone.
Okay. One more before we go back to the panel and
I have the mic
Doctor.
here. I'm not sure. Do we have? All right. Elma Kay from Belize Network of NGOs. And Victor's question is for you. In your analysis, of course, looking at the macroeconomic picture, we look at sort of like what's the tangible, right? But the results of this is we're looking at the rise of inequality, poverty, all these other measures. I come from the environmental sector. How do we incorporate the intangible, right? All the things that we take for granted, because there is a reality in balancing development and well-being. So do we want to, we talk about potentially growing services, manufacturing, everything will have an impact on key resources, for example, that we take for granted, like the abundance of water, how clean our water currently is. How do we start factoring some of these ecosystem services that, in fact, do represent a part of our economy, but are unaccounted for?
Okay, thanks. So, Dr. Castillo and then Professor Bulmer-Thomas. We'll come back.
I think the question was if any study has been done on to the best of my knowledge, no. But I also know that the World Bank and the IMF, that has been a consistent part of their recommendation to government. So I would think that possibly they did some studies. If there were any local studies by government, I'm not aware. But the reality is that in Belize, the public officer retires at 55. And then the average life expectancy is 74. So government keeps on paying that person for 19 years after retirement. And yes, and that is unsustainable.
Well, if I may, I'll start with Elma Kay's question, because a lot of people have built input-output models designed to incorporate the environment. Now, there are obviously shortcomings about this, but at least it's an attempt to expand the notion of an input-output table so that it deals with key questions, including water resources, environmental questions, and so on. It still leaves you with the difficult choice when you're confronting a trade-off, but at least it's easier to be more transparent about what those trade-offs are. But I think lying behind your question, I was very struck by the contrast between what you might call the environmental impact assessment, EIA approach, and the input-output approach. In Belize, people will come along with a project, say for Key Chapel, and it looks incredibly attractive, and very quickly governments will make up their mind, yes or no. And once they've said yes, you sort of know what's going to happen when the EIA is done. The pressures are just so enormous. And so the EIA approach, I think, is too dangerous because it's too subjective. It risks just focusing on certain big projects and with this idea that we must go ahead with this if we're to, transform the economy and so on. But you can't do it just with a handful of projects like that. So I've always been in favor of using input-output analysis for these broader issues, including the environment. Now, there are countries that do it. There are also countries that use it, and this is slightly away from your question, to look at income distribution. So Costa Rica, which is practically a neighbor of Belize, has an enormous input-output table, which they produce every year. And they use this to look at the impact of different projects on income distribution. Now that's, if you like, the gold standard of what obviously special concern to me because I built the first ever input-output table for Costa Rica. Now, thank goodness, they're using up-to-date ones and much bigger ones and much better ones. But the point is that is definitely a way to go. Idalia, your question about tourism is so right, and I always keep coming back to this question that George Price posed back in, the late 70s and early 80s, which is, do we want to be hewers of wood and drawers of water? And the title of one of my books on the Caribbean is called From Slavery to Services, The Struggle for Economic Independence. It's a big and difficult question. I don't have a simple answer. I would say, however, that I'm in one sense quite conventional. Not in many, but in one. And that is, I think that Belize does have to build an export-led model. And so somewhere in the mix, there has to be a major focus on exports. I do think, though, that once you expand this input-output table from my tiny little 6x6 to something more representative Belize, like 40x40, you can start to get a much better handle on how these service exports and the different kinds of tourism can impact on the economy as a whole. And then I think you're in a better position to deal with what you just raised. Dylan, may I just quickly add something? Nobody asked this question, but I think it's really important. You remember figure 1, and of course it talks about GDP per head and it goes back to 1980. Now, to do that, you'd have to know what the population has been every year between now and 1980. You'd think that was simple. It's not. The reason it's not simple is that Belize has a census roughly every 10 years, but in between those 10 years, it estimates what the population is going to be. When the census is published, it's always very different from what the estimate is. Now, the logical thing to do is to then work backwards. You take the census, the most recent census, and then you make it consistent with the census 10 years ago, and then you adjust the data in between. But although Belize must do this because the World Bank have this data, it's not available in Belize. So you have to go to the World Bank World Development Indicators database to find it. I'm assuming it is the Belize authorities that do it. Now, when we come to this, so that's the first thing. Now, when we come to population going forward, this is very relevant to this question of GDP per head. We know that the difference between births and deaths is roughly 1% of the current population. So if there was no migration, no net migration, the population would grow about 1%. But there is migration. And net migration in the last 10 years has been running at about 0.5% a year. So in other words, more people coming in than are going out. So you get the two together, 1% births over deaths, 0.5% for migration, net migration, 1.5%. So obviously, if you want to increase living standards, you have to grow above 1.5%. But now there's a certain Mr. Trump in Washington. He is deporting Belizeans, right? But not only does that bring Belizeans back who might otherwise have gone, in many ways that's a good thing, but it also means that it's less likely that Belizeans will go to the United States. Then there's a third thing. If you're coming from El Salvador and planning, or Guatemala or Honduras and Nicaragua, and you're planning to go to the US, you know your chances of getting in are now much, much lower. But you're determined to leave your country. Some of those will come to Belize. They will definitely come to Belize. So the net migration in Belize, I don't think it's going to be 0.5% in the next 10 years. I think it'll at least be 1%. So I think the population growth could easily be 2% a year. So then if you're talking about how fast GDP has to grow to have a decent increase in living standards, well, the minimum, in my view, would be 2.5% in living standards, which means 2% plus 2.5, 4.5. So the Belize GDP at constant prices really has to grow at 4.5%. I heard the CEO, and I thought your ideas was a very good account of what the government is doing. I have a lot of sympathy with it. Is it enough to deliver, going forward over the next 5, 10 years, real growth in GDP of 4.5%? I don't know. All I know is that the IMF, not a body I normally defer to, is saying that it'll be 2.5%, starting at 2.5, falling to 2, whereas it has to be 4.5%. It's a big gap. I hope you're right. I hope the IMF is wrong. I just throw that out there as something that one needs to think about.
I would just like to share, Doc, that if you go back to maybe the question that Dr. K asked, when I was at the Ministry of Health after Hurricane Mitch, we saw the Bella Vista village triple in size in a little over a year. So when you have those physical risk events happening, we get net migration in Belize that causes our growth rate of the population to grow perhaps quicker than the islands. So that's something where the environment as well impacts what's happening to us.
Dr. Cal had his hand up. Yes, go ahead.
My question has to do with people as a comparing the Caribbean and the temporary or sub-regions within which we operate. And I'm curious, Professor Victor, how do you explain the fact that we are doing badly in both, but not as badly in the Central American sub-region? What accounts for this? Thank you.
Yes. Hugh O'Brien, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, the assessments presented, I just want to add, in a sense, maybe not so much a question, but they are, apart from migration, one of the issues that Carlos Paul and we reflected on at the Ministry of Economic Transformation is that our population of 410 or 415,000 people are distributed within 7 towns, 2 cities, 237 villages spread all over the country, in addition to another 30 or 40 smaller communities. And so both the public and the private space for investment, the services, the cost of delivering services to these people, road infrastructure, education, health, okay, simple access, having to have a school in some of these villages providing transportation, it's putting a major burden on Belize's investment capital. And so that just adds another dimension to the challenges that we face as a nation. While in Caribbean, the countries are smaller, they're more compact, you could take that 400,000+ people, put them in one small town, one small city, and pave all the streets and provide all the services. You add to that Belize's population under 18 years of age is also very high, a high percent. The working population is about 160,000, of which at least 20% are underemployed. They're not working for a full week. And so there's 120,000 people in Belize working, earning an income to have to take care of 400,000 plus. It adds a new dimension. When the population dynamics change and you have more older people, then you have the challenge that you mentioned, where the working population now have to keep paying these older persons who are now retired. So Belize has some serious structural matters that have to be addressed. we can talk about corruption at various levels, not at politician level alone, but all along the chain of command within the public service, customs, BAHA, police, immigration, etc.
Thank you. I see that they're trying to fix the mic problem here, but there's a question up front.
Yeah, good morning. I'm David Robertson, Assistant Professor, Faculty of Science and Technology. And a theme that came up here is a theme that I've encountered in other places. So last year, SIB had their research conference, and it was access to data. We have loads of information in various NGOs and different ministries, but those data just sit hidden and we can't access it. Same sort of idea came up with Central Bank when I went to their research conference. It's come up with my grad students who are working for agencies and cannot get the data from their own employer to do the research. And since this is a policy research discussion, I wonder, might there be something like sunshine laws or open records laws or some kind of policy put into place to make it easier to access these data?
That was a very interesting set of questions. And first, I'll try and answer Angel Cal's question. I think you really have to take a very long view of this. I think if you go back to the end of the Second World War, the arrival of aircraft carrying tourists and so on, essentially the Caribbean was much quicker to get into the opportunities that mass tourism and service exports provided than Central America, which is why you got a much higher level for GDP per head by the time you get to 1980. Belize eventually jumped onto that bandwagon, but it did so much later than the rest of the Caribbean. I mean, now, for better or for worse, sometimes for worse, there are plenty of Caribbean countries in that list of 34 where more than 90% of exports come from service exports, and nearly all of that comes from tourism. That's not a position Belize should want to be in because it has this opportunity of other kinds of exports. But I think it explains why by 1980, or say 2000, the gap between the difference in the Caribbean as a whole and Central America as a whole. Of course, there are all the civil wars in Central America to take into account, but that is basically the reason. And if you look at the two countries, Panama and Costa Rica, which are richer than Belize within the Central American region, it's really service exports that explains that more than anything else. I know there are other factors. On this question of the data, well, I haven't really thought about that, but I think that's a very good point, and one that I'd like to think about more, and others in this room will be in a better position than me. What I would say, more generally, is that there is a major deficiency with regard to the data needed to do proper studies of income distribution and wealth distribution in Belize. I know that CEO Paul mentioned the shift to a multidimensional poverty index as proposed, which the Belize statistical authorities are following. I'm not against that, but I don't think it's enough because I do think Belize needs to have measures like the Gini coefficient in order to be able to compare itself with other parts of the two regions in which it works, but also to compare itself over time. The last time a Gini coefficient was produced for Belize was 2009. The one before was 2002. So much has happened since then that it's really difficult to believe that that there hasn't been something there that warrants serious attention. And so in terms of data gaps, this is, in addition to what you just mentioned, I think that government and the SIB and the central bank need to pay attention to collection of data on income distribution that can help to answer these questions. On your question, I think that's probably better addressed to Mr. Castillo, but I thought it was a very good question.
Doc, you don't have any responses to that, okay? Before going back, Victor, you mentioned Costa Rica being sort of a Rolls-Royce model. There are other countries that have this input-output approach, and you didn't want to talk necessarily about who to do it or who is responsible, but to poke at that a bit in the context of Belize. Assuming that it would be SIB that would be producing the input-output table, I don't know if that is a correct assumption, but who in the structure of government, which ministries or departments would be best suited to do the analysis and to produce the policy recommendations from that to the decision makers?
Well, you won't know this necessarily. Yes, you will, because you actually initiated it. But there was a Zoom meeting. When was it? It was a year ago. You helped set up a Zoom meeting that I had with the SIB and the central bank with regard to using what the SIB has already produced, these supply and use tables, to turn them into an input-output table. And it was a very encouraging meeting. But I know that it's difficult because it still requires additional resources. It costs money, even though 80% of the hard work has been done. And of course, if you're to go forward, that work will have to be repeated to bring it up to date and all the rest of it. Clearly, the SIB would have to be central to that, but they will need the input from the central bank when it comes to the bits within that input-output table dealing with final expenditure and the distribution of wages and profits and all that sort of stuff. But those two bodies together will be perfectly capable of doing the work that's required. And that work would then sit, I don't know within which ministries, but I mean, I imagine that for most people here, they know very well which ministries would be responsible. And I'm no doubt at all that they would work well together on that, and the result will be very, very useful indeed. I just showed you a little 6x6 just to show you how that it can be done, not because I want anyone to go away from this room and use that 6x6 table, because that's a sort of Mickey Mouse table. I mean, you need something much more sophisticated than that. Privately at home, I have produced a 40x40 input-output table for Belize, but I'm not going to show that to anyone because that is something that needs to be done here officially, and then with the stamp of government on it, so that it can be, you don't want rival versions of input-output tables floating around. So that's what I'd say there.
Hey, Doc, I want to ask you a question. And looking at one of the slides from Nigel Clark, what he showed was that there are three things that diminished in the Caribbean looking at 2021 to 23 or to 2019 compared to 1981 to 20. And those are physical capital, human capital and population, and total factor productivity. And the one that diminished the most is the total factor productivity. I understand that to mean use of technology and workers' knowledge has diminished the most. In this day and age of talking about AI and technology, what kind of opportunity do you see for Belize to maybe invest in areas like that to try to improve productivity? I would say in a shorter period of time, because these are deep structural issues we're discussing and there are no easy fix. I think you have to have a strong macroeconomic base. So all the discussions that Doc was referring to is very salient, because if we don't get it right in terms of how we manage our fiscal space, then we can never get it right to try to answer some of these questions. But, what's the opportunity there for technology?
Well, it's enormous. But just to backtrack a little bit, this concept of total factor productivity keeps coming up. So we need to be clear what it means. Let's suppose that labor inputs increase by 20% in the next 5 years. The capital inputs increase by 20% in the next 5 years. And then you look at what's happened to GDP. If it's risen by more than 20%, then you can be sure that total factor productivity has improved. If it's risen by less than 20%, it means that total factor productivity has gone backwards. Now, we understand from various studies that total factor productivity in Belize has gone backwards in the last 20 years. The trouble is that we have no way of being sure about it because we have no way of measuring the growth of capital inputs. We can measure labor inputs, but the data really don't exist to measure capital inputs. So to get a handle on total factor productivity, you probably have to approach it in different ways. The key is almost certainly the educational system. And the educational system, like these AI innovations you're talking about, these are things that pay off big, but they pay off in the long term. And this is where running governments is such a difficult task because the pressure is always on for short-term results. But actually, to get the best results, you need to think long-term. And in terms of the education system, if you're improving, say, primary education, you're not going to get the benefits for another 20 years or so, and yet it's obvious, I think, to most people who work on Belize economy, Belize society, that the big change needs to come in the educational system, primary, secondary, and tertiary level. Yes, I'm sure something will come from the adoption of AI. I don't think we should exaggerate it. Certainly in my country, my temporary country, until I become a Belize national, in the UK, I think the benefits from AI have been massively exaggerated. And I think a lot of companies are now finding that it's not the savior that they were expecting, and that they are going to still have to spend money on the sort of things that they have been spending money before. It's just that they'll be spending additional money on AI. I don't think it's going to save them a huge amount of money. And I don't think it's going to improve productivity enormously either. I may be wrong about that, but I'm skeptical.
Thanks. We have time for one more round of questions, and I'll go 1, 2, 3. Yes.
For all the panelists, I guess, Dr. Bulmer-Thomas, wanted to go back to the question of tenure, land tenure, and perhaps to Dr. Vernon as well, in terms of trying to do that study, who owns what. It would be interesting to see if if BelPri is able to get data for that study from wherever. And so my question was, could you comment on the issue of land tenure in terms of looking at trade-offs, for example, services and tourism? For that study would be, it's not just who owns what, but where, because it would be interesting to see what that spatial structuring looks like. Can you comment on land tenure in terms of moving into sort of a more service, for example, in tourism? Coming from a community perspective, a lot of the things that we get from the communities is it's either privatization for private landowners or foreign interests, or sometimes example from conservation interests, but both of those really translate to the communities as impact in terms of no access. And so I just wondered whether you had any comments on that. Sorry, my name is Evis Chan from Environmental Research Institute.
I've been thinking about the question of how you close the gap between population growth and GDP growth. And a question that came to my mind is the contribution of the informal sector, which we always reference, but we tend to minimize in terms of that impact. And I think it's huge. I remember seeing some data post-COVID. It was preliminary, but Belize had suffered much less a fall in GDP than other countries. And, speculation is that, there's no data because we don't measure it. And so is not this a possibility in terms, because that contribution is there. Sometimes we see a divergence between what the data are showing and actually how people are living. And so in thinking about closing the gap and in thinking about data, is this not something we should also be thinking about, how we get a handle on the contribution? Admittedly, some of it's illicit, but how we get a handle on that, also that contribution with respect to closing that gap. And I will just on the comment on AI, the Swedes pioneered, they were ahead in terms of the application of AI in the classroom, to the extent that they even almost abolished hard copy texts. They've gone the other direction because they see that the part of the brain that AI is processed through is not the critical thinking zones. And so what you see is a correlation between increased use of AI and a decline in critical thinking. So that's just to comment on Victor's comment.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon, Professor Thomas. Thanks for being here with us and sharing your paper and presentation. And thanks, Dr. Vernon and your team here for presenting to us. An area I am not surprised being in the productive sector for the last, first of all, I'm on the Board of Trustees at UB, Clifton Irving, and I'm the chairman of the Citrus Growers Association. I come from the productive sector, working in industries of banana, airline, and the local transport system in my career. And in the last 25 years, I'm not surprised that we are falling behind. And some areas that I see that we can do and need to initiate is that of developmental finance, for example. Another area is how do we underpin these developments with floors of insurance for natural disasters and things like that. And so the issue of de-risking, we see that those issues have played a critical role, and those are issues that we do not necessarily discuss in our public remit, but they have tremendous effect on people who participate in these industries. So in my own industry, if you look from 2000, we had about 900 citrus growers. We have about 200 now. Bananas, the same thing. And in other areas, we have the shrimp industry. The other area is the area of R&D. We have a tendency not to invest in R&D any at all. So if you look at Wall Street, one of the things that they would look at when you present your balance sheet is how do you invest in R&D? And depending on that investment, that is how the level of risk they are going to take in terms of how the capital is going to be deployed. And so the whole issue of capital deployment, investment in R&D, and how the public and the private sector and the FDI mesh together is very important. And I strongly believe that if you don't have a strong domestic investment platform, the FDI will be very weak. It will be ad hoc and things like that. And so those are the areas that I think that would affect check some of these things, as well as you have pointed out education. We know that the issue of technical education have been a problem with the IT vets and things like that. And so I think that if we could put some more reports and be more intentional in our public policies and how those interact with our private policy, I think we could do better with our human capital and our development. Thank you.
Victor, those were a mix of comments and questions. I don't know if you want to briefly respond to any of them before we close.
I think the question on land tenure and so on is, this is obviously one of the keys, and this came up in the Jules Uncut program that I was on last week, because land is one of the principal assets in Belize, and when it comes to the distribution of wealth, it's absolutely essential. But unlike some of the data problems that you were mentioning, this data definitely exists. It's a question of how you access it, because somewhere in Belize, people know who owns what piece of land and under what terms and so on. And really, a huge effort now needs to be made by institutions like BelPri to get back to the knowledge that one had about the distribution of land in the 1970s, to update that information. And I think Belizeans need to prepare themselves for a terrible shock when that information is published. And it's going to feed into all the other things we've been talking about here today. Income distribution, the impact of tourism, and all that sort of stuff. But you've got to start with the data. You can't speculate and plan and build policy without that fundamental knowledge. And it's not something, if you were starting from scratch, to build an input-output table will take you quite a long time. Fortunately, in the case of this land tenure stuff, it's there. It's just a question of pulling it together and having an understanding what that impact might be. And Idalia, on the informal sector, of course there's an informal sector in Belize, but it's not like in Peru. I mean, this informal sector is of a manageable size. And one of the ways in which GDP is measured, the final expenditure side, it's picking it up. So if you're in the informal sector, you're spending on consumption or your purchase of imports. That should be in there, the fact that you're in the informal sector. The problem comes when there's a big shift from the formal to the informal, or from the informal to the formal. I don't think we've seen that in Belize. And maybe in COVID, the informal sector increased in importance. That is quite possible. And that may have affected what happened to the GDP and all the rest of it. But you and I will just have to talk about that more later on. And the points you made were very, very good. But nobody so far has mentioned what to me is the elephant in the room. And that is that if you're talking about private domestic investment in Belize, you've got to look at the interest rates that the banks will charge. And it is really hard to imagine that with a loan at 14%, anybody is able to run a successful, legitimate business. If you look at the successful domestic business groups in Belize, they do not borrow from the banks at 14%. And so something, I mean, how you square that circle, I don't know. You could just, put up your hands and say, well, let's carry on with these existing business groups. Let them continue to accumulate wealth because in some cases they're doing a very good job. Or you try and tackle those spreads within the banking system, which are really holding back legitimate private domestic investment, and it's one reason why it's so low. Remember that figure of 11% that I showed you earlier on? That's far too low for a country that needs to be growing at 4.5 to 5% a year.
I see there's one more question. We're going to be wrapping up soon, but we'll give you the opportunity to ask your question. Did you raise your hand, Ambassador Schuman? Oh. No, I saw you raise your hand, but you were pointing out. Okay, thanks. Yes, go ahead, please.
All right. Good morning, Professor, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, sorry. So in small developing countries such as Belize, our export portfolio would be, surrounded by Belize exporting raw materials, primary materials, and we import secondary and tertiary commodities from advanced countries. So this puts us like in a perpetual balance of trade deficit. So in your opinion, what is the feasibility of us developing a model to export more value-added commodities to kind of reduce our balance of trade deficit?
You did raise your hand. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a political question. I think that's allowed, right? And it's to our dear professor, British professor, soon to be a local Belizean boy, who is used to political questions, having been at Chatham House and so on, right, Victor? Question is, at independence, our beloved father of the nation and all of us are saying, we got political independence now. Now we must fight for economic independence. My question to you is, 1981, 2025, are we more or less of a dependent nation today than we were in 81? And by how much and why?
And the last question will go to Dr. Metzen. Right here.
I don't know if anyone can answer this, but in terms of going back to how we stimulate private investment, so the scale, we have many SMEs. And so in addition to looking at interest rates, when I look at the tax code and I look at the tax regime, and you look at the taxes charged on the gross, well, if you look at investment patterns and you look at this contributions of startups, it takes about 5 years before, on average, 5-7 years for business to actually come into profitability. And so most tax regimes give deductions and allow you, and I'm talking beyond the GST threshold, which allows you some room. You're not taxed until you reach a certain threshold. But to my mind, in addition, you would also have to look at the tax system and look about how you design tax laws that encourage entrepreneurship investment, because we are, in terms of scale, we have many small entrepreneurs, and the government is looking at this in terms of the MSC policy. So is that not also as binding a constraint as, let's say, interest rates? And I'm not sure I also buy the argument on interest rates. If you look at the cost of doing business and you take into account scale.
Okay, thanks. Victor, as you answer those questions, could you also use the opportunity to give any final comments you might have?
Thank you, Dylan. Now, the first question, I know what I wanted to say, but just remind me again. That was... Sorry, that's right. Yeah. This is something I've repeated at various points, but I'm going to repeat it again. Belize is in 2 regions, and all the countries in these 2 regions, all of them are engaged in service exports of one kind or another. On commodity exports, I don't think there's a huge amount more that Belize can do. I think it's unlikely that Belize is going to discover some legitimate legal commodity which it can then export and outcompete Brazil or Mexico or wherever it is. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think the shift will continue to be from commodity exports to service exports, with some possibility for manufacturing assembly. The point I want to make is within those 34 countries in the Caribbean, or 33 if you exclude Belize, and the 6 in the Caribbean, excluding Belize, that's nearly 40 countries. And if you look very carefully at the service exports that they're all engaged in, I am certain that you will find some which Belize is not engaged in and which could be done successfully and profitably. Some are beyond the reach of Belize. La Guyane, the former French Guiana, makes a fortune from its launch site for satellites and rockets and so on, all paid for by the European Union. That's their major service export. That's not going to happen in Belize. But if you're looking in more microeconomic detail to the individual countries, yes, you will find some very, very interesting examples. And that's not an expensive exercise to do. It's something that the Ministry of Economic Transformation could undertake in a fairly straightforward way. The second question. Oh, from Ambassador Schuman. I think the answer is actually quite straightforward. Economic independence has reduced. I think Belize is more economically dependent now than it is less economically independent than it was in 1981. Of course, it's more politically independent, as you well know. And it has demonstrated that, for example, on its position on Palestine and all the rest of it. But on terms of economic independence, I think it's less economically independent than it was in 1981. And I mentioned, various things. Once you have Belize now, I know thanks to the blue bond, the ratio of debt to GDP has gone down. But the fact is the ratio of debt to GDP is a lot bigger than it was in 1981. And when you have a large debt ratio, that gives you, that reduces your degrees of freedom. And of course, one of the consequences of the blue bonds is that the Nature Conservancy now plays, fortunately, it's a very good NGO, but the fact is that to some extent, Belize has outsourced its economic sovereignty to the Nature Conservancy in order to meet the conditions of those, of that debt swap in the first place. And then you have all the problem with the banking system and the de-risking that we were talking about earlier on and the pressures that brings on Belize. So, yeah, I'm afraid I think that there's a very simple answer to that. Of course, it's the same for everybody else. It's not that Belize is different, but I think it's something we should be honest about. So just quickly to finish up, I thought that was a terrific set of questions, and I really appreciate that. I hope that in the fog of war and all the rest of it, we won't forget what I said about the input-output table. Because I do think genuinely, with a little bit of effort and money, Belize could now go that next step to looking at the economy in a very different way, which might generate new paradigms and so on. Imagine when you have, instead of just something called GDP, one homogeneous commodity or service, you have a model or a table with 40 rows and 40 sectors, and in looking at the intersection of each of these and their impact on the environment, on income distribution, on water resources, and all that sort of stuff, I think it would open up all sorts of exciting possibilities. And I think for the young ones who are now getting into economics and economic policy for the first time, it's a great thing to do. You'd be surprised how many countries use it. A lot of them use input-output analysis as a check on their national account statistics. It's a very good way of making sure that you're getting the right results when it comes to national accounts. But Others use it for all kinds of studies, and not just in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's very popular among the members of the Asian Development Bank as well, for example. And all the big countries, I think with the exception of my poor, dear, belighted United Kingdom, they all use it as well in one form or another.
Thank you so much, Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas. And you can rest assured that BelPri is a convert to the input-output table, and that we will be, as an institute, working for the next step after this, which is to do the advocacy necessary to ensure that eventually Belize has one. And I think that's a big difference with perhaps the last intervention. We now have an institute that will be following up. And when we were taking a first look at Victor's first draft of his paper, one of the readers had commented that, or asked, why use per head? Why not use the term that we all know, per capita? And I see Devon is smiling, my policy analyst, because he's the one who made the comment. But Victor stuck to his guns, and it doesn't really matter what we call it, but in addition to the importance of the input-output table, I think you will agree that per capita GDP is something that we have to look at much more on a regular basis when we do our statistical analysis and we do our sort of reflection, how we're doing. And so that would be also something that we'll be pushing. In fact, as a quick example, if you had been hearing the news recently about this screw worm situation, Belize has been boasting or saying that we have the fewest number of cases in Central America and Mexico. And while that is true, if you do a per head count of cattle, we would be actually the highest. So it shows you the importance of per head in our analysis. It only leaves me to say two things. One, the report is available, free access, free of cost, on the BelPri page on the UB website, and also using this very QR code. And that will be BelPri's policy, free access of the research that we do, and we will be doing much more to make it accessible. And one of the ways is to have in brief, a short back and front executive summary, as well as a broke it down, which would be 10 to 12 points of the paper broken down into takeaways that are key. And of course, the full report is 4 to 6 pages. So please, take a look at that, share it with your students, share it as much as you want. In terms of closing off then, it is for me to thank our panelists, first of all, Dr. Castillo, Theo Paul, and Mr. Emery Ford from the Central Bank, to thank all of you for coming out today and participating in what we call at BelPri bridging knowledge to power, at least a part of that. Thanks to our chairman, Henry Anderson, for welcoming us today. And most importantly, Victor, thanks to you for choosing BelPri as the conduit through which you share this important paper. Victor could have gone to some of the most illustrious journals and published this paper, and he chose BelPri at UB to do it. So, Victor, thank you very much. We will take it forward. Thanks, everyone.